February 1, 1943. The sun rose over the parched landscape of Algeria, casting long shadows across Biskra airfield, where the engines of 12 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses were already turning, warming in the cold morning air. These were the bombers of the 414th Bombardment Squadron, part of the 97th Bombardment Group, the first American heavy bombardment unit to arrive in the European theater, and now, 5 months after Operation Torch, stationed in North Africa under the command of the 12th Air Force. Their mission that morning was straightforward but dangerous: strike the docks at Tunis, the Tunisian capital still firmly in Axis hands, and sever the supply lines feeding German and Italian forces fighting desperately to hold on to their last foothold in North Africa. Among those 12 aircraft sat one B-17F-5 BO, serial number 41 to 24406, bearing the name All-American 3 painted on her nose. She was not the newest bomber in the squadron, having arrived at Bangor, Maine back in July 1942, then flown across the Atlantic to England before being reassigned and sent to Algeria in November, finally reaching Biskra on Christmas Day just 5 weeks earlier. But she was solid, reliable, and on this February morning, she would become legendary. At the controls sat 24-year-old Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, Jr., a pilot whose calm demeanor masked the intensity required to command a 10-ton bomber through flak-filled skies. Beside him in the right seat was Second Lieutenant Godfrey Boyd, Jr., the co-pilot, whose hands hovered near the controls, ready to assist at any moment. Behind them, Navigator Lieutenant Harry C. Newsell hunched over his charts and instruments, calculating wind drift and ground speed, ensuring they would find their target in the vast Mediterranean theater. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Lieutenant Ralph Burbridge crouched behind his Norden bomb sight, the most closely guarded secret in the American arsenal, preparing to guide their payload onto the Tunis docks with mechanical precision. The rest of the crew consisted of men who had trained together, flown together, and now faced death together with a matter-of-fact professionalism born of necessity. Staff Sergeant Joe C. James served as the flight engineer, responsible for monitoring the 4 Wright Cyclone R-1820-65 engines that powered the flying fortress through the sky at nearly 300 miles per hour. Technical Sergeant Paul A. Galloway manned the radio position, maintaining contact with the squadron and monitoring for enemy transmissions. In the cramped ball turret suspended beneath the fuselage, Staff Sergeant Elton Conda, a substitute gunner that day who had asked Bragg if he could fly the damn plane and received the terse response, "Can you shoot the damn guns?" prepared to defend the bomber's vulnerable belly. Staff Sergeant Michael Zook occupied one of the waist gun positions, scanning the sky through the open window where his .50 caliber Browning machine gun protruded. And isolated at the very end of the aircraft, past the bomb bay and beyond the waist, sat Staff Sergeant Sam T. Sarpolis in the tail gunner's position, alone in his small compartment with 2 machine guns and a commanding view of any enemy fighters attempting to attack from behind. The bombers lifted off from Biskra in the pre-dawn darkness, climbing steadily eastward toward Tunisia. Below them, the landscape transitioned from the brown desert of Algeria to the more fertile coastal regions near Tunis, where ancient Carthage had once stood and where now German and Italian forces desperately clung to their supply lines. The flight was uneventful at first, the steady drone of engines, the occasional crackle of radio traffic, the careful maintenance of formation as the dozen bombers moved as one toward their target. They were unescorted. The fighter groups that would later provide protection for heavy bomber formations were not yet available in sufficient numbers in North Africa, and so the B-17s relied on their own defensive armament, up to 13.50 caliber machine guns bristling from nose, tail, top turret, ball turret, and waist positions. The flying fortress earned its name through this defensive firepower, creating overlapping fields of fire that could, in theory, protect against attacking fighters from any angle. But theory and practice, as the men of the 414th knew well, were not always the same thing. At approximately 13:25 hours, 25 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, the formation released its bombs over the Tunis docks. The Norden bomb site had done its work, and tons of high explosive plummeted toward the warehouses, cranes, and ships below. Black puffs of flak burst around the bombers as German anti-aircraft gunners filled the sky with shrapnel, but the B-17s held their course, completed their run, and began the turn for home. That was when the Messerschmitts arrived. The Luftwaffe fighters were Bf 109GS from Jägerschwader 53, experienced pilots who had been battling Allied aircraft over North Africa for months. In particular, 2/JG-53 had been developing new tactics specifically designed to counter the heavily armed B-17s. Rather than attacking from behind, where the tail gunner and waist gunners could concentrate their fire, the German pilots had begun making head-on passes, diving toward the bombers from ahead, presenting a difficult target while aiming for the most vulnerable part of the flying fortress, its nose, where only a few guns could bear. Two Bf 109s attacked from the right front of the formation simultaneously. One went after the lead bomber, piloted by Major Robert J. Coulter. The second fighter set its sights on the All-American III. In the nose of the B-17, Bombardier Ralph Burbridge saw the Messerschmitt growing larger in his gunsight. Wings ablaze with muzzle flashes, the German fighter bored straight toward them, its single propeller a blurred disc, the black crosses on its wings stark against the lighter camouflage paint. Burbridge squeezed his trigger, sending streams of .50 caliber rounds toward the oncoming threat. The gunners in the lead bomber joined the fight, their tracers arcing through the air. For seconds that stretched into eternity, the air between the bombers and the fighter filled with lead. "I was firing at it all the way," Burbridge would later recall. The fighter, piloted by Feldwebel Erich Paxia of 6/JG-53, a 16 Victory Ace flying a Bf 109G for/TRO, work number 16093, suddenly froze in its trajectory. One of the American gunners had found their mark. The pilot, either killed or severely wounded by the defensive fire, slumped in his cockpit, unable to complete his roll and pull away. What happened next occurred so fast that the human mind struggled to process it. The disabled Messerschmitt shot over the B-17's cockpit with a deafening whoosh, close enough that Bragg and Boyd could have reached out and touched it had the plexiglass not separated them from instant death. Then, with a tremendous metallic shriek that drowned out even the roar of 4 9-cylinder radial engines, the fighter's wing plowed into the rear fuselage of the All-American III. The impact was catastrophic. The Bf 109's wing cut diagonally through the bomber's fuselage like a giant knife, slicing from the base of the vertical stabilizer downward and forward. The left horizontal stabilizer and elevator, critical control surfaces that governed the aircraft's pitch, were completely torn away. The fighter broke apart, pieces of German aircraft embedding themselves in the American bomber structure. Control cables, the mechanical linkages that connected the pilot's control columns to the rudder and elevators, were severed. 2 of the 4 engines, both on the right wing, went dead. The 4th engine, on the left inboard position, began leaking oil from a damaged pump. "When we hit, our plane almost stood up on its tail," Burbridge remembered. "Then we went down at a very sharp angle. I thought to myself, boy, this is it." In the cockpit, Bragg and Boyd fought the controls. The bomber lurched violently, nose pitching up, then dropping into a steep dive. Without the left stabilizer, the aircraft was aerodynamically unbalanced, wanting to roll and spin. With severed control cables, the elevator and rudder no longer responded to the pilot's inputs. By every rational measure, the All-American III should have entered an uncontrollable spin and plummeted into the Tunisian landscape below, taking all 10 crew members to their deaths. But Bragg was not a man given to panic. His hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency, his mind racing through options. The engines. He still had 2 good engines on the left wing, and possibly a third if he could nurse it along. The throttles still worked. That meant he could control thrust asymmetrically, using power to influence the aircraft's behavior. Then he remembered something else, the autopilot. The B-17F's Norden bombsight was connected to an autopilot system that used electrical wires, not mechanical cables, to operate electric motor servos mounted next to the rudder and elevator. If those servos were still functional, if the electrical wires had somehow survived the collision while the mechanical cables had not, then perhaps, just perhaps, he could still control the aircraft. Bragg engaged the autopilot. The servos hummed. The aircraft responded. It was not perfect control, far from it. The bomber wallowed through the air like a wounded animal, unstable and unpredictable. But it was enough. Enough to keep them flying. Enough to turn toward home. Behind the pilots, in the back of the aircraft, the crew assessed the damage. What they saw was almost incomprehensible. Through the gash in the fuselage, daylight streamed in where there should have been aluminum skin. The entire tail section, from just after the waist gun positions to the very end of the aircraft, hung on by what appeared to be little more than thin strips of metal near the right horizontal stabilizer. The diagonal cut was so deep that a man could have stepped through it. The fuselage flexed and moved independently, the tail oscillating relative to the main structure as if connected by a hinge rather than solid airframe. And in that precarious tail section sat Sam Sarpulus, the tail gunner, isolated and alone. The intercom still functioned, and Sarpulus reported that he was uninjured but acutely aware of his predicament. His compartment moved with every gust of wind, every change in power setting, swaying and flexing in ways that no aircraft tail was ever designed to move. Below him, he could see the ground through the gaps in the torn metal. One strong gust, one wrong maneuver, and the entire tail section might separate completely, sending him tumbling through the sky in his small metal coffin. The crew considered their options. They had parachutes, all 10 men had donned them when the collision occurred. They could bail out, take their chances in enemy territory, hope for capture rather than death at the hands of hostile locals or vengeful German soldiers. Some crew members moved toward the exits, preparing to jump. But Bragg made a decision. They would try to make it home. All of them. Together. He communicated this to the crew, his voice steady over the intercom despite the crisis. They were approximately 90 minutes from Biskra, 300 miles across the Mediterranean and the North African coast. If they could keep the bomber flying that long, if the tail section could hold together, if the damaged engine didn't seize, if they didn't encounter more fighters, if a dozen other variables went their way, they might survive. The flight back was agonizing. Every minute felt like an hour as Bragg nursed the crippled bomber westward. He flew carefully, avoiding any sudden maneuvers that might stress the damaged airframe. The autopilot servos maintained basic control, but required constant attention and adjustment. The 2 functioning engines on the left wing labored to keep the heavy bomber airborne, while Bragg feathered the propellers on the dead engines to reduce drag. Behind him, the crew did what they could to stabilize the situation. They moved equipment forward, shifting weight away from the damaged tail section. They monitored the flexing fuselage, reporting any changes to Bragg. And they watched the sky for enemy fighters, knowing that in their current condition, another attack would certainly be fatal. Sarpulus remained at his post in the tail. He had nowhere else to go. Crossing from the tail section to the main fuselage would require navigating through the very gap that threatened to tear the aircraft apart. He could only sit, watch the ground pass below through the torn metal, and trust that his pilot could perform what seemed like an impossible feat. Minutes became miles. The Mediterranean coast appeared ahead, then passed beneath them. They crossed into Algeria, leaving enemy territory behind. The landscape became more familiar as they approached Biskra. Then came perhaps the most dangerous moment of the entire ordeal, the landing. Bragg had to bring the bomber down without its left horizontal stabilizer, with compromised control systems, with a tail section barely attached to the rest of the aircraft. A normal landing would be difficult enough, this would require precision and delicacy beyond anything he had been trained for. He lined up on the runway at Biskra, the airfield growing larger in the windscreen. Airspeed decreasing. Altitude dropping. The bomber descended through the hot North African air toward the packed Earth runway. As the main wheels touched down, Bragg's task was to keep the tail elevated as long as possible, using the control yoke and throttles to prevent the damaged tail section from striking the runway with full force. The main gear absorbed the initial impact, rolling now, slowing, the tail settling gradually, carefully, until finally the entire aircraft rested on the runway surface. An ambulance raced alongside the taxiing bomber, medics prepared for casualties. When the aircraft came to a complete stop and the crew emerged, first through the normal exits, then through the gash in the fuselage, and finally Sarplas descending a ladder from his tail compartment, the medical personnel found their services unnecessary. Not one of the 10 men aboard had suffered so much as a scratch. The medics stood aside in disbelief as the crew gathered on the ground, staring up at their aircraft. Only then, with the weight of the crew removed and the stress of flight relieved, did the tail section of the All-American III finally give way. The weakened metal crumpled, and the entire rear portion of the aircraft sagged to the ground, separating almost completely from the forward fuselage. The bomber had held together just long enough, just barely long enough, to save the lives of 10 men. The photograph taken that day, showing the All-American III, with its tail nearly severed, became one of the most famous images of World War II. The sight of the massive diagonal gash, the missing stabilizer, the tail section held on by what appeared to be little more than faith and a few strips of aluminum, seemed to defy the laws of physics and aerodynamics. How had this aircraft flown? How had it returned home? The answers lay in the skill of Lieutenant Bragg, the ingenuity of using the autopilot system when mechanical controls failed, the robust design of the Boeing engineers who had built redundancy into the flying fortress, and perhaps a measure of sheer luck. For the crew of the All-American III, their war was not over. After brief rest and reassignment as needed, most would continue flying combat missions over North Africa, and later over Europe as the Allied campaign pushed northward through Sicily and Italy. They had survived the impossible, but many missions still lay ahead. As for the bomber herself, the All-American III proved that even such catastrophic damage could be repaired by determined maintenance crews working in the harsh conditions of a North African airfield. Over the weeks following the collision, ground crew at Biskra worked to restore the aircraft to flying condition. The tail section was repaired or replaced, control systems were rerun, engines were serviced, and by the time the work was complete, the bomber was deemed airworthy once again. She was reassigned to the 352nd Bombardment Squadron of the 301st Bombardment Group at St. Donat, Tunisia, and continued flying combat missions. While her flight characteristics may have been slightly compromised by the repairs performed in field conditions, you cannot simply bolt on a salvaged fuselage section and expect the aircraft to perform exactly as before. She remained operational. The All-American III flew mission after mission throughout 1943 and 1944, surviving the war when so many other aircraft did not. Finally, on March 6, 1945, more than 2 years after the collision that should have destroyed her, and just 2 months before the war in Europe would end, the All-American III was dismantled for salvage at Lucera Airfield in Italy. She had served with distinction, surviving not just the dramatic collision over Tunisia but countless other missions through flak and fighters. Her service record stands as a testament to the durability of the B-17 design and the determination of the men who flew and maintained these aircraft. The incident over Tunis on February 1, 1943, came to symbolize both the resilience of the B-17 flying fortress and the skill of American bomber crews in the most desperate situations. The story spread throughout the Army Air Forces, becoming the subject of countless retellings, some accurate, some embellished with details about crews using parachutes to hold the aircraft together or completing the bombing run after the collision, details that were later refuted but which spoke to the mythic quality the event had acquired. The 414th Bombardment Squadron adopted a new emblem inspired by the incident, an image of a puppy praying atop an aircraft's tail section, a visual representation of the prayer that many crew members must have uttered during that harrowing 90-minute flight back to Biskra. The phrase, "comin' in on a wing and a prayer," became associated with the All-American III, though the famous 1943 song of that name by Harold Adamson and Jimmy McHugh was actually written about another 97th Bomb Group B-17, the Thunderbird. For the German pilot, Feldwebel Erich Paxia, February 1, 1943, marked the end of a career that had seen him achieve 16 aerial victories. His Bf-109G plunged to Earth after colliding with the B-17, and the young ace, just one of hundreds of skilled Luftwaffe pilots who would die in the Mediterranean theater, became another casualty in a war that consumed lives with industrial efficiency. His squadron mates in 6/JG-53 continued the fight, developing and refining the head-on attack tactics that had proven so dangerous to American bombers, but the ultimate outcome in North Africa was inevitable. By May 1943, just 3 months after the All-American incident, Axis forces in Tunisia would surrender, ending the North African campaign and opening the way for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. The broader context of that February 1, 1943, mission reveals the desperate nature of the air war over Tunisia in early 1943. The 12 unescorted B-17s of the 414th Bombardment Squadron represented a small force attempting to interdict Axis supply lines at a critical moment. German and Italian forces, pushed back from Egypt by British and Commonwealth forces and now facing American and Allied armies advancing from the west, depended entirely on supplies shipped across the Mediterranean and unloaded at ports like Tunis and Bizerta. Every ton of ammunition, fuel, and food that could be prevented from reaching Axis forces brought closer the day when those forces would have to surrender. The Luftwaffe fighters defending Tunisia in early 1943 were experienced, skilled, and desperate. Units like 2/JG-53 and subordinated elements like Jules Meinberg's 11/JG-2 fought with the knowledge that they were outnumbered and that defeat was likely, but they fought nonetheless with professionalism and courage. Meinberg himself was shot down and badly burned on that same February 1 mission, bailing out of his Bf 109G, after American gunners set his fighter ablaze. He would survive his injuries, but his experience exemplified the attrition that would ultimately destroy Luftwaffe combat effectiveness in the Mediterranean. The men of the 414th Bombardment Squadron, and the 97th Bombardment Group more broadly, were pioneers in American strategic bombing operations. The 97th had flown the 8th Air Force's first heavy bomber mission from the United Kingdom on August 17, 1942, when they bombed a marshalling yard at Rouen in France. Transferred to North Africa in November 1942 as part of Operation Torch, they adapted to a different kind of war, lower altitudes, desert conditions, shorter missions but often without fighter escort and targets that were more tactical than strategic. From November 1942 through May 1943, the 97th's B-17 struck shipping in the Mediterranean and attacked airfields, docks, harbors, and marshalling yards across North Africa, southern France, Sardinia, Sicily, and southern Italy. Their mission was to cut supply lines to German forces in North Africa, and they succeeded. In June 1943, they contributed to forcing the capitulation of Pantelleria Island. They bombed in preparation for and in support of the invasions of Sicily in July and southern Italy in September. When the 97th was reassigned from 12th Air Force to 15th Air Force in November 1943, their mission changed from tactical support to strategic bombing. From November 1943 through April 1945, they engaged primarily in long-range missions to targets throughout occupied Europe, oil refineries in Ploesti, Romania, aircraft factories in Steyr, Austria, marshalling yards in Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Greece. They received a Distinguished Unit Citation for leading a strike against an aircraft factory at Steyr on February 24, 1944, during the intensive air campaign known as Big Week. They received a second Distinguished Unit Citation for a devastating raid against one of the Ploesti refineries on August 18, 1944. One member of the 97th Bomb Group, 2nd Lieutenant David R. Kingsley, was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for actions on June 23, 1944. During a mission to Ploesti, his B-17 was seriously damaged and the tail gunner was wounded. When the crew was ordered to bail out, Kingsley gave his parachute to the gunner, whose own parachute had been damaged, and assisted him in bailing out. Kingsley died moments later when his bomber crashed and burned. His selfless action exemplified the bonds that formed between crew members who faced death together mission after mission. The 97th Bombardment Group flew its final combat mission in April 1945 and was inactivated in Italy on October 29, 1945. Over the course of the war, from their first mission over Rouen in August 1942 to their final missions over Austria in April 1945, they had participated in every major campaign in the Mediterranean and European theaters. They had lost aircraft and crew members to flak, fighters, weather, mechanical failure, and the simple accumulated stress of combat operations. They had also compiled a record of effectiveness that contributed materially to Allied victory. For Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, Jr., the pilot of the All-American III, the mission of February 1, 1943, was apparently not considered sufficiently extraordinary to warrant individual decoration beyond the Distinguished Flying Cross he received for his overall war service. This seems remarkable in hindsight, the skill required to keep a bomber with a nearly severed fuselage flying for 90 minutes and then landing it safely surely merited recognition. But perhaps in the context of the air war, where crew members routinely performed acts of courage and skill that would seem impossible under peacetime conditions, saving one's own aircraft and crew was considered simply part of the job. The same might be said of all 10 crew members aboard the All-American III that day. Pilot Bragg and co-pilot Boyd who flew the crippled bomber home. Navigator Newsell who kept them on course despite the chaos. Bombardier Burbridge who fired at the attacking fighter and witnessed the collision from the nose compartment. Engineer James who monitored failing systems and shifting stresses on the airframe. Radio operator Galloway who maintained communications. Ball turret gunner Conda who had asked if his pilot could fly the plane and received a response that proved abundantly accurate. Waist gunner Zook who helped assess the damage and worked to stabilize the situation. Tail gunner Sarpolis who sat isolated in the swaying tail section for 90 minutes, trusting his life to strips of metal and his pilot's skill. And ground crew chief Hank Highland who, upon seeing the damage to his aircraft, must have considered the repair job ahead and somehow found a way to make the bomber airworthy again. Their story, the story of the B-17, All-American III, and the mission of February 1, 1943, endures because it represents something fundamental about human courage and ingenuity in the face of impossible odds. The aircraft should have crashed. The laws of aerodynamics suggested it could not fly. The damage was too severe, the control systems too compromised, the structural integrity too degraded. But the men aboard refused to accept the inevitable. They found a way, through skill, through improvisation, through determination, and perhaps through a measure of luck, to survive. In the broader narrative of World War II, the All-American represents just one bomber, one mission, one incident among thousands. But it stands as a symbol of the resilience not just of the B-17 flying fortress as a machine, but of the human spirit under pressure. When faced with certain death, Lieutenant Bragg made the decision to try, not to give up, not to accept fate, but to fight for survival with every resource at his disposal. His crew followed his lead, each man performing his duty despite fear and despite the seeming impossibility of success. The photograph of the All-American III, with its tail nearly severed has circulated for more than 8 decades now, shared and reshared, the story retold with varying degrees of accuracy. Some versions place the incident over England rather than Tunisia. Some add dramatic details about parachutes being used to hold the aircraft together. Some claim the crew completed their bombing run after the collision rather than before. These embellishments, while inaccurate, speak to the power of the true story, that even without fictional enhancements, the reality of what happened on February 1, 1943, was extraordinary enough to capture imagination and inspire admiration. The truth is compelling enough. A bomber attacked by an enemy fighter. A collision that should have been fatal. A pilot who kept his damaged aircraft flying through improvisation and skill. A crew that worked together to survive. A 90-minute flight across hostile territory with a fuselage held together by luck and a few strips of aluminum. A landing that required perfect touch and timing. And finally, all 10 men walking away uninjured from an aircraft that collapsed only after they had exited safely. In the decade since that February day, only 3 B-17F flying fortresses remain in existence, preserved in museums as reminders of an era when these aircraft filled the skies over Europe and Africa. The All-American III is not among them. She was dismantled for salvage in 1945, her aluminum recycled, her frame cut apart, her serial number 41 to 24,406 surviving only in records and photographs. But her story persists, carried forward by those who recognize that sometimes, in the midst of industrial-scale warfare, individual acts of skill and courage can transcend the statistics and become something more, legends that remind us of what humans can accomplish when faced with impossible challenges. The men who flew the All-American III home that day were not superhuman. They were ordinary young men, some barely out of their teens, others in their 20s, who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet them. Their names deserve to be remembered: Bragg, Boyd, Newsell, Burbridge, James, Galloway, Conda, Zook, Sarpolis, and Highland. They did their duty, saved their own lives and each other's, and then continued fighting in a war that would claim millions before its conclusion. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned many names during World War II: the Flying Fortress, Old Girl, the Fort, the Flying Coffin by those who suffered losses in them, the symbol of American air power by those who celebrated them. But perhaps no single aircraft better exemplified the toughness and resilience that made the B-17 legendary than the All-American III, the bomber that flew home cut nearly in half, defying physics and fate to deliver her crew safely back to Earth.